Welcome back, everybody, and we're chatting about St. Thomas Aquinas with our good friend Mark McNeil. And right before the break, Mark, you were talking about how important St. Thomas is, especially for education for young people. And when it comes to Aquinas, the comprehensiveness of his thought is really staggering, along with the clarity. Like it never becomes jumbled or unclear, or there's areas where large sections of philosophy or theology that aren't touched. He's able to integrate the whole faith in a very reasonable and clear way.
Oh, absolutely. Reading Thomas is a real delight. Once you kind of master about 20 terms that he uses that are kind of specialized terminology. I say specialized. They're not. They weren't specialized in his time because they were part of the lingo that people used in talking about things. But in our time, they're a little bit foreign because some of those words have changed their meaning some in the way we use them. But once you get a sense of his basic set of terms, it's rather easy to read him. In fact, it's rather delightful to read him because he tends to be very, very succinct. And I think you alluded to this earlier, the way that he structures things, especially in the Summa Theology. He begins with a question, and then he poses arguments against his own position. And he chooses the arguments that are the strongest. And so he doesn't set up straw men or weak arguments. He sets up the strongest arguments against his own position. He poses those arguments, and then he lays out the principles that are needed in order to properly understand the subject. And then he goes back and responds to the objections. And so it's once you get used to his style of structuring things, it stimulates the mind because you can read the questions or the objections and it gets your mind working. Like, well, how's he going to answer that? Or
Yeah.
where are those objections wrong? And then you see the principles, and then he applies those principles. And so it's almost like creating a Socratic dialogue. It's like creating a dialogue on every subject that he deals with. And I find that I am very, very rarely disappointed in what I find in St. Thomas. I mean, almost always there's some insight or some new, conclusion that I didn't see because I lack the power of intellect that he had to see all of those ramifications of an argument or whatever. And so I find that almost always I'm enriched by and I learn from what I find in St. Thomas. A Summa is something like an encyclopedia. And so the Summa Theology wasn't really meant to be read from beginning to end. It was meant to be used as a resource for teaching, first of all. And so if you read the very beginning of the Summa Theology, he basically says, this is intended for, some people laugh at this, that it was intended for beginners in the study of theology. But the assumption in the Summa Theology is that you have a guide, you have somebody that's going to help you learn these things. And what St. Thomas has given us are the basic tools that we need to properly understand all these different things that he's going to discuss in it. So anyway, it's just St. Thomas's writings are a constant resource. I've got a set of them right behind me on the shelves. You can't quite see them. Well, actually, on the top shelf you can. And I reach for them regularly when I think about different areas of theology or get a question or a challenge. I quickly go and see if I can find something in St. Thomas that will address it.
Yeah, and one thing that always impressed me, and it's pretty rare that you'll see this in the Summa Theologica, is very rare Thomas will dismiss an objection. He always, all the objections have some good to them. They all speak to a certain truth, but they're missing some sort of aspect. So I love the way how he uses objections as a didactic tool. It's not just there to represent an opposition, but he uses that to bring them to where they ought to be, with the truth.
Absolutely. Aquinas was a very, very logical thinker, and he could make distinctions that bring clarity to things. And so he could quickly see that, for example, a term may be used in three different ways. And if you use it, equivocally, where you use it with one meaning and you really intend another, and that creates confusion in the conversation. So regularly, St. Thomas will say, okay, here's an objection, let's look at that word. That word can be used in two different senses, and I'm using it in this one, in this context. And so he brings clarity while we often kind of muddle around in confusion about how we're using our terms. And so St. Thomas is a wonderful guide, not only to what he argues for, but also as an example of clear thinking, of just clear, logical consistent reasoning that is conscious of being precise and being clear so as to avoid confusion.
Yeah, yeah, and I wonder if your experience squares with mine too. Is once you're able to digest a good portion of the Summa, it's almost like that's a prep for all the other areas he's going to investigate. It's almost you know something about even some of the subjects he hasn't yet addressed because it's kind of lays down the groundwork for other areas like moral theology or sacraments or attributes of God, things like that.
Oh, for sure. No, yeah, and there are many questions that have arisen since St. Thomas's time that he was not conscious of, like nuclear war or, all the different moral questions that have arisen from modern science, for example. But with all of those, as you pointed out, you can find principles in St. Thomas that you can apply to all these various scenarios or situations, and so there are plenty of great minds in the Catholic tradition who continue to mine the works of St. Thomas and find resources to help us address issues that St. Thomas was not even conscious of in his own time that have arisen since then, but that he had something meaningful to say about them.
Yeah, in fact, that's what I was going to ask you. Is Aquinas more of a relic of the past, or is it more still a vehicle for insights, new insights? And you kind of already answered that, but if you want to expound a little bit more on that, that's great.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there are aspects of St. Thomas's thought that are archaic. There's certain scientific developments, and he very much followed the kind of science of Aristotle that was pre-modern, and St. Thomas didn't have the insights of modern astronomy, for example. But St. Thomas is even very careful there. I mean, he will acknowledge, for example, that even things that were taken to be certain truth, like, for example, Ptolemy's view of the universe, where the Earth is the center of all things that are revolving around it. St. Thomas acknowledges in one of his other writings that is a very persuasive understanding of the world, that saves the appearances. It can explain what we are observing through our senses, but it's not absolute. It could be something that is not certain, and may be overturned in the future by further observation. So St. Thomas, even though there are elements of his thought, especially the more scientific elements of his thought borrowed from Aristotle and others, and we've learned much more since then about those kinds of things. I think the theological framework of St. Thomas, because of the great care that he exercised in it, the theological structure and framework and philosophical structure of his thought, I think is still very persuasive and extremely valuable for us today. And I continue to find it to be successful as a framework, a basic framework to operate out of for sharing the Catholic faith today.